what I wanted to share is a study I did a couple of years ago. Um, and actually, I was confronted with the question, and part of this material was then adopted by the council and included in our study paper. And I found, while this is a little bit complex, perhaps it comes down to, I think, some pretty simple concepts, and that is the fact that the holy days, in contrast to the secular holidays and the pagan holidays that we don't celebrate, are tied directly to the Hebrew calendar, which in turn is tied to the heavenly bodies. So I want to and go through maybe a little bit quickly, but I shared in the comments the PDF of what we're going to go through. So hopefully it'll be a resource that you can use to study this topic in a little bit more detail. Now, while this is a little bit technical, perhaps, and you ask yourself, okay, the Hebrew calendar, who would ever ask a question about this? I share this because I literally was asked about this very topic in none other than a business meeting. So you never know when you might be asked this. But what I think is more important, for at least it was for me personally, is to be able to believe with confidence that the days we keep are on the right day. And the obscure topic we're going to go into for the time we shared this morning has to do with the Hebrew calendar and the more obscure thing of the so-called postponements. Okay, going to the next slides. Here's what we're going to look at, because it's a slice of a big topic. Number one, how the moon and the Moeds, the Moed is the Hebrew word for feasts, how those two are connected. I have to move my little thing here so I can see my whole slide. Can you still see me in the corner? Or did I move it out?
We can still see you, John.
Okay. The second thing is the issue of postponement rules of the Hebrew calendar. And number three, do these rules postpone the holy days away from the time appointed by the quote unquote heavenly clock created by God for signs, seasons, and for days and years? And again, this all goes back to being asked the question. I had relatively new people ask me about this topic a couple of years ago, and they made the point that you can't just postpone a day. I mean, we would not consider postponing Sabbath by one day to Sunday, for example. So I hope going through this will help clarify what this is about. So here is the quote from Genesis, where God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, seasons, and for days and years." So when you just read that, it doesn't really maybe connect in the English translation to holy days, but when we look at the entire context in the Hebrew, as we will in a minute, you will see the connection. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So that's from Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 and 16. So we'll do a little bit of the Hebrew word study here. The Hebrew word me'ar is used for the word light. Again, like I said, we'll go through this a little bit quickly, and then you can use this as a resource. So what we learn here is that there are three hierarchical categories of lights: the great light to rule the day, the sun; a lesser light to rule the night, the moon; and then the stars are almost in the context given as a, I mean, they're a lesser light, as it says, stars also. And then here's where I think that this is what I hope you will connect to. The three lights have a purpose that extends beyond just transmitting light, and it has a purpose that connects directly with the Sabbath and holy days. So number one is signs. For example, in Exodus chapter 31, verse 13, the Sabbath is listed in verse 13 and 17 as a sign. And for me personally, Exodus 31, verse 13 and 17 were the scriptures that convicted me now almost, well, not almost, exactly 40 years ago this year, to change my historical practice of keeping Sunday to Sabbath. Number two, seasons. So seasons in Genesis are actually the Hebrew word moed, which is used for my feasts in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2. So what we see here is that these lights were created to establish these moeds. And then number three, it is the word for days, yom, evening and morning. In this case, the fourth day, and the seventh day and the first day. I'm really thankful that God inspired Moses to write 6 times in Genesis chapter 1 that it was evening and morning the first, second, third, and fourth, and fifth, and 6 days. Otherwise, people would argue that those days were maybe a period of time, which the word can also mean. And then finally, sana is the word for years. So we have three lights with this purpose. So I'm not going to go through the Hebrew words studies other than this moed one, because I think this is important to understand that the that these lights were properly appointed to specifically denote a festival, and we can be confident that we're celebrating the feasts on the correct days by virtue of looking, as we will here in a minute, on what the phase of the moon is at a given holy day. So the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles always occurs on a full moon. In fact, our children and our grandchildren to this day always are excited on the first day of these feasts, because typically when you go outside as the day starts, the moon will be up in the sky and full. And when you're specifically when you're going to the feast, I always find that inspiring. So we've got a couple pages here with Hebrew word studies. Just bear in mind that seasons in Genesis chapter 1 is the word moed, which is the Hebrew word that is used for festival in Leviticus chapter 23. Okay, clicking through a couple of these. And if you want to take some notes, I don't know if this is customary, but when we conclude, I'm happy to answer questions and go back and look at and clarify some things. I probably should have asked at the beginning whether that is what you do, but I'm certainly open to that if you want to. Okay, here is a very important scripture. Psalms 104 verse 19 says that he appointed the moon for Moeds. So, irregardless of calendar calculations, ultimately the authority of the establishment of the holy days and when they fall is the moon. And we see here, and we can be confident of that because in Psalms 104, verse 19, it says that the moon was specifically appointed for this particular purpose. Again, a Hebrew word study. Let's skip across that. So here is what we can take from Psalm 104, verse 19. God created the moon, number one, to establish the time appointed for the feasts on a specific day of the month. So a couple things to note here is the word Kodesh is introduced here, and a specific day. I will just comment that the Hebrew word yom can refer to a period of time, much like the English word can refer to a specific 24-hour day or for a period of time. We talk about in the day of this and in the day of that, and it means a longer period of time than the day. However, in the context of a festival, it's referring to a specific day. For example, the Passover is on the 14th day of the first month. The first day of unleavened bread is on the 15th day of the month. So if the new moon determines the start of the count, so you just from the new moon you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to 14 and 15, and then you are able to establish the day. What we will see here a little bit later is the moon is whether or not the moon is completely full on the 15th day of the first and the 7th month. Here is Leviticus chapter 23. So speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the Moeds of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. Again, to hearken back some 40 years, and I think many of you probably had a similar experience, you come to realize that these feasts are not something that a man created, but rather something that was established by God. And God in Leviticus chapter 23 takes ownership of the day. And that should both sober us and inspire us, because it's not some kind of human invention. It is rather something that God established, which also should give us pause to make sure that we are properly observing and doing it on the right day. Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 4. These are the feasts, again, Moeds of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. So not just any old time, but rather at a time appointed, these feasts are to be proclaimed. And it's interesting that the word proclamation here is used, which is the the Hebrew word korah, korah. So it anticipates what we what is now proclaimed through a Hebrew calendar where you can calculate years in advance or years going back, and it established the day with accuracy. It's a mathematical computation. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5, on the 14th day of the first month, at twilight is the Lord's Passover. So the moon establishes the beginning of the month, and then you count, and on the 14th is the Lord's Passover. So we could look at the Hebrew calendar, or we actually, it's not that difficult to do, as I'll show you later. You can actually look at the moon and establish this based on that, which is what the calendar ends up doing. Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 6. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So going back to this meeting that I had in Georgia, this was back in January, leading up to the holy days. Like I said, we had a 2-hour discussion in which the nuances of the Hebrew, the Julian, and the Gregorian calendar were discussed. And I found it interesting that the founder and president of a pretty substantially sized company was interested in this. I thought I'd make an elevator speech. I ended one of the things I've always um, used is only answer the questions that they ask. So when he initially asked the question about the Sabbath, I thought it would be a relatively short conversation. It ended up turning out to be a 2-hour conversation in which I had to talk about the Julian, the Gregorian, and the Hebrew calendars. So it was a rather remarkable experience. Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16 says this: 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and the feast of tabernacles, which shall not appear before the Lord, when they shall not appear before the Lord empty handed. So here, the text introduces another Hebrew name for the feasts. So all feasts are moeds, but not all feasts are hogs. I have a chart here. Let's see if I'll jump forward here a little bit. Here we go. So I made this little chart. You have the Sabbath, the Passover, all of the feasts referred to as moeds, but the three, shall we say, big festival seasons, unleavened bread, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles, are also known as hogs. So a hog is a feast, especially one observed by pilgrimage. So on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and especially the Feast of Tabernacles, anciently and even today, we travel considerable distance in order to come together as and convoke to be able to keep the feasts. And I just had the discussions this week with several people, and they were talking about where they're going to be going to the feast, and we travel great distances to be with brethren of the same mind. So we still observe this to this day. And I'll just say, I think in the Church of God, we are probably, as a group, the most traveled group of at least of anything that I've been aware of. People traveling internationally and having the the sort of experience that was mentioned as we were fellowshipping, learning about different cultures is a very enriching experience that I know I would have never had I not been in the church. Okay. Okay. So now let's get a little bit more specific here. So let's take a look at the trumpets. So Psalm 81, verse 3 and 4 says, blow the trumpet, the shofar, at the time of the new moon, which is a Kodesh, at the full moon, Hazim, on our solemn feast day, a Hag, for this is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. So the trumpet was to be blown at these particular times to denote and to celebrate the new and the full moon. So that was a way of announcing the time appointed. Here we have in Numbers 10:10. Also in the day of your gladness, in your appointed feasts, Moeds, at the beginning of your month, you shall blow the trumpet. So by virtue of blowing the trumpet, it was kind of an ancient thing. Today, you know, we have a paper calendar that announces it, but it's about a very specific time. It's not just something that you can move back and forth or celebrate whenever we have the time. Next one. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 24. So on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. So in the fall, when we have the pilgrimage feast, it commences with the Feast of Trumpets, denoted by the blowing of the trumpets to announce this holy convocation, and that is at the new moon. And then you count 15 days and you get to the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and the moon on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, if everything is correct, should be a full moon. I make mention of that because the question that I had to answer for some new people was, how come this year does the Hebrew calendar postpone it by a day? Of course, it sometimes happens that it's postponed by 2 days. The English word postponement actually has the wrong connotation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm just giving you kind of a heads up of where we're going, and how the moon plays into that. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 37. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. So now we come to the question. I went kind of fast through that. I want to talk about the postponements with the full and the new moon, and then I'm happy to take questions at the end, and we will use the time in that way. Okay, so what about this question of postponements? So the sun rules the day and the year, and a year is 365.242374 days long. And it takes for the Earth to orbit the sun, this would make a month 30.4368645 days long. So, if you are an engineer, as I am, or a mathematician, these numbers may be of interest to you, going out all the decimal places. But this actually shows the problem. At least currently, the year is 365 days and a quarter, roughly, long, and the month is also not a whole number. And what that means is, um, it's not equally divisible. So you're going to have some issues with where the days fall, simply because of the fact that it is a 365 and a quarter year and a 30 and a half day month. So the way calendars deal with this is to have a 30-day and a 31-day month, and you do that to stay aligned. The moon then rules the month in the Moeds, and a lunar month is 29 and a half days long. So the year has 12.368 lunar months. So this is the fact that God said these lights are designed to establish days, years, and months, and establish signs, and the fact that we have a year that is not an even number provides a challenge that has to be worked out in some manner. Okay. So the feasts and the holy days and the fullness of the moon. The first day of unleavened bread, as I mentioned, is on the 15th of Abib or Nisan, which is that's a full moon. The Feast of Trumpets, the first of Tishri, is a new moon. And then the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles is on the 15th, which is a full moon. So we have some markers here. And what the Hebrew calendar does, and what we can do, is to take a look at the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and see whether or not the moon is full. And this was, for me, immensely reassuring and inspiring when I did this and went through it, to see how closely things line up. This is an aside. If you go back to the computation of a year, up until NASA had the Webb telescope, the Hebrew calendar was the most accurate computation of the length of a year of any calendar. And when they had the Webb telescope and they were able to take it out a few more decimal places, the Hebrew calendar was not wrong. It was simply the telescope enabled them to take it out a few more decimal places. Okay. Now, so going back to Psalms chapter 81, verses 3 and 4, I think it's important to note that the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the feast are both a Hag, and they fall on a full moon. And this is a statue for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob. So we're not going to be pushing that around. That's well established. Psalm 81, I believe, is a Psalm of David. So that was written a long time ago. And when the Bible talks about a statue for Israel and the law of the God of Jacob, it is something that's not easily changed. Or, well, I should restate that. It's something that will not be changed. So we get back to the question of the postponement rules for the Hebrew calendar. Are we actually pushing the day by a day and thereby violating this law? And that was the sincere question of this new family that had come into the church. They left the evangelical church, were avid Sunday keepers, and when they realized that God had established a Sabbath, they took it seriously enough to break with their family and observe the Sabbath and the holy days. And then, like 2 years in, all of a sudden they realized, wait a minute, now we're postponing this. How can that be right? If you can postpone a holy day, why can't we just postpone a Sabbath to Sunday? So this was helpful in explaining to them what it was about. So then the question is, can we test this? Can we test it year by year? So here is a graphic for 2025. The fullness of the moon at moonrise in Jerusalem on Saturday evening, April 12th, and Monday evening, October 6th. And I took the average between the two. So in 2025, the Hebrew calendar moved the I mean, if we want to be technical about it, what they do is they move um the first day of Tishri by one day, and then everything gets calculated from that. But another way of looking at it is the first day of unleavened bread was moved by one day. So what you see here is the postponed day was 99.8% full. The moon was 99.8% full at moonrise in Jerusalem on that day. If the calendar had not done that, the postponement, it would have only been 97.5% full. And when I looked at this, I thought, oh wow, that's interesting. This is like a leap day. It's like a leap year on the Gregorian calendar. Um, so what it's in reality doing is calibrating the calendar to align with the moon, which God created specifically to establish the holy days, as we read earlier in Scripture. So when I did this, it was like, wow, this is great. I mean, I can have confidence that we're doing this on the right day because the moon is actually full on the postponed day. So then the question became, all right, that's great. It worked for this year. What about all the other years? So that created a little bit of work for me. So I actually did the calculations and went back to 1978, which is more than two 19-year time cycles. And the postponed holy days always have fuller moons than the non-postponed. So the Hebrew word used for the Hebrew calendar for postponement is actually, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, dehoith, which would probably be better translate. It can be translated adjustment. So the people who speak Hebrew, this word doesn't, it can mean postponed, but the Hebrew language is pretty elastic and words can have different meanings. So I wish that they had not translated it postponement, that if they had translated it adjustment or leap day to calibrate the Hebrew calendar to the full moon, I think it would have made it a lot easier for people to understand that we're not actually moving the day. We are calibrating just like February has 29 days every 4 years and to be able to keep the calendar aligned with the annual cycle. Okay, so let me just show you some examples here. So here we have, what year is this? I have to move my here is 2023. So the postponed moon on the eve of April 5th in 2023 at moonrise, again, I just took Jerusalem because, well, Jerusalem is where these calculations were done originally. So in 2023, it was 99.7% full. If it had not been postponed, on April 4th, again, it's 97.4. And actually, if you look at the graphic, that's visible to the human eye. I mean, it's pretty substantial difference. All right. Here is the Feast of Tabernacles in 2023. The postponed moon on September 29th was 99.9. I don't think you can get much closer than that. The unpostponed moon the day before would have only been 99% full. So this worked in 2025 and 2023. What I then did in order to make it a little bit more summarized, if you take these two and average them for the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacle, it's 99.8 versus 98.2. All right. So I went back through all the years, 2025, 2024, 2023, 2022. And in every single case, going all the way back, I'm just giving you, see how far I go here. I went these graphics go all the way back to 2012, but I actually did the calculation, and in our Hebrew calendar paper that's on the UCG website, it goes all the way back to 1978, and it always works. Surprise, surprise, it always works. Of course it works because it's based on the statute and law that God established all the way back to the beginning. So now if you're so inclined, here's the reference. This is the program. It's called MoonCalc. And this was April 5th, 2023. It just shows the calculation. You have moonrise at 6:25 in the evening, 1825, and then the moon was at that time 99.7% full. Okay, so that concludes this study or message, whatever you want to call it.